It's interesting that we seem to have an uneasy agreement with the independence of the Fed.
I think the main limitation on independence is you guys set the goals. That's so they don't have independence with respect to their objectives. That's set by the people's representatives. That's just independence about how they
Right.
get to
Well, I think this is where the rubber hits the road, because obviously we have political pressures that the Fed should not have. For example, the last time President Trump was President Trump, he clearly wanted to influence the Fed. I mean, I think we could all agree on that. He certainly said that about Mr. Powell. I mean, that's where I get concerned, and some of these executive orders get very close to that. Most people, most families, really deal with the economy with their job, their employment. And I think that's why it's so important to have the dual mandate, because again, this shouldn't be, the Fed shouldn't be for the very wealthy that control most of the assets. It should be for the economy of all the people. And most of the people, the way they interact with the economy is their job.
The chair now recognizes the ranking member of the task force, Mr. Vargas, for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And again, I want to thank all the witnesses here today. I appreciate it. It's interesting that we seem to have an uneasy agreement with the independence of the Fed. I mean, I was curious to see that the first question that the chairman asked was the limitations that the Fed has in their independence. And Mr. Cohen, the question was directed to you, and you gave a very interesting answer. I would ask Mr. Conzal, I mean, it is interesting that we seem to agree on the independence of the Fed, and then very quickly we go to limitations of the Fed. Could you speak a little bit more, because you said that this is probably the most important issue that we'll talk about on this task force. Could you go a little more into depth about that? Because I think that, again, with the dual mandate and the independence, those are the two most important things that we should focus on in this task force. Go ahead, sir.
Yeah, absolutely. So, accountability is quite important, and Congress obviously sets the goals for the central bank as, legislative bodies across the world set the goals for their central banks. And then, there's reporting back. Obviously, Chair Powell and other Federal Reserve chairs have come and, talk to Congress twice a year. There's a lot of transparency in the way that they're talking about their actions, how they're carrying them out. I actually feel that there's a lot of public accountability with media and so forth on their actions as well. What I would worry about is executive control of their day-to-day functions, excessive control about the way in which they're conducting, in the way that they are prioritizing and balancing their different priorities in a ways that reflect short-term political gains but may have long-term economic costs.
Well, I mean, one of the
Can I pick up
sure.
a little bit? So I think the main limitation on independence is you guys set the goals. That's so they don't have independence with respect to their objectives. That's set by the people's representatives. That's just independence about how they
Right.
get
Well, I
to
think
those.
this is where the rubber hits the road, because obviously we have political pressures that the Fed should not have. For example, the last time President Trump was President Trump, he clearly wanted to influence the Fed. I mean, I think we could all agree on that. He certainly said that about Mr. Powell. I mean, that's where I get concerned, and some of these executive orders get very close to that. Mr. Consul, isn't that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. And the executive orders as currently stated, and obviously everyone's trying to figure out what's going to actually happen, but to the extent they can politicize the Federal Reserve functions of financial regulatory policy, many other things, I find that there's no way to have a strict wall and separation between the monetary policy and the regulatory policy. I do not think that works in practice. When I talk to people who have worked at the Federal Reserve, they agree that that's not a clear, separate room you can just put someone in. The supervisory functions seep into the monetary and open market policy discussions in a way that I think really risks the stability of our macroeconomy in a way that we're going to talk about a lot of different things here, but I really want to emphasize.
Yeah, so I do want to now move to the dual mandate. Now, one of the things that I heard today in testimony, I think it's true, that most of the assets of the United States are held by very few people. Most people, most families, really deal with the economy with their job, their employment. And I think that's why it's so important to have the dual mandate, because again, this shouldn't be, the Fed shouldn't be for the very wealthy that control most of the assets. It should be for the economy of all the people. And most of the people, the way they interact with the economy is their job. Employment. Could you comment a little bit about that?
Yeah, what I'd emphasize, and obviously we're going to talk about the 5-year review, there's many different central banks among peer and developed countries that have many different ways of trying to implement their policies. And so all of them saw the same inflation we saw. So the ECB is a very austere central bank. It has just a price stability mandate. Their inflation peaked at 10%, and it was rising even before Russia's invasion of Ukraine. You can go to New Zealand, which was one of the first inflation targeting banks. It has a reputation as having a particularly effective central bank. They use a range from 1% to 3%, which I think might be a very effective thing for us as well. And their inflation also peaked at 8%. So the dual mandate did not cause our inflation. What probably played an important role in was the huge labor market recovery we saw both in 2019 before COVID and over 2023 and 2024, where we have record high levels of labor force participation for women, for minorities, for people with disabilities.
This is where I reclaim my time, because I think one of the things that used to drive me crazy about Janet Yellen I think she's one of the smartest people who was here. And every time she was asked about inflation, she never put it in the wider context of the world. Instead, of course, my good colleagues on the other side would beat us up, and rightfully so, about inflation, because it was hurting our people. But she never put it in the context of the whole world. The EU was running much hotter than we were, and she never mentioned it once. Even though I have great respect for her, she sure blew it on that one. With that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Hill, the full chairman of the committee, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thanks, Chairman. Appreciate the panel. Great testimony. We're grateful for that. Dr. Michelle, you said that you think the Fed's trying to do too many things. I heard that, and Mr. Wang talked about that as well. Dr. Cohn, in your testimony, you say maximum employment is given by influences outside the control of the Fed, particularly the structure of the labor market. And then you say inflation is also subject to outside influences, but over time the Fed can control inflation. So would you say that of the so-called dual mandate, that price stability is certainly something the Fed has more direct influence over rather than quote-unquote full employment, which is severely impacted by regulatory policy, tax policy, spending policy, budget deficits? Is that true?
Yes, I think economists would agree that over time, inflation is, as Milton Friedman put it, everywhere and anywhere, a monetary phenomenon. That doesn't mean that the money supply directly feeds inflation, but the Federal Reserve can control inflation over longer periods of time. In terms of full maximum employment, basically the level of maximum employment, the lowest possible unemployment rate, is inferred from the behavior of other variables around it. So if you push the unemployment rate...
But you're not arguing that you're a Phillips curve guy, are you, Dr. Cohn?
Yeah, I'm a Phillips curve guy.
Okay.